Welcome back to Moments That Matter and our series that we just have begun on books that matter. For this week's installment, we have invited our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Sircy, to talk about his book that matters, which is Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger, which came out in 1961 in book form, but which appeared earlier in article form in the New Yorker. Jonathan, why don't you take it away and tell us a little bit about your encounter with this book?
Thanks so much for having me on the podcast and for giving me a chance to think about the book and reread it. I reread it over the weekend in preparation for our conversation. And I think the big thing I came away with is if you or your audience members are thinking about books that had an influence on them, and then you go back and read the book 20 plus years after the fact, you've just got this gigantic Venn diagram in front of you with hardly little overlap between why you thought you loved the book and what's actually in the book. And so I read the book my senior year of high school. I was in Colorado visiting Colorado College, which is this weird liberal arts school that makes you take one class at a time for 3.5 weeks. And that's the way you get through your required number of courses for the year. It was the college furthest from my home in Kentucky that I was visiting. I stayed with my aunt. That summer, between my junior and senior year of high school, I'd read Catcher in the Rye in a fever dream of a week and thought it was brilliant. And while I was staying with my aunt, I saw on her bookshelf an early edition of Franny and Zooey. And I was like, you know what? I want to read that. And so I asked her to be able to borrow it. And I basically kept it in my backpack for the next 2 years. So that's my relationship with the book. This is the book, probably the Franny section in particular. If you asked me what book have you read the most in your life other than the Bible, the Franny section of Franny and Zooey would have been my answer. And if you asked me as a creative writer, I was a creative writer as an undergraduate, a creative writing and English double major. What piece of work in the world would I most like to have written? I would have said the Franny section from Franny and Zooey. So that's my personal connection to the book. I read it a whole lot and I wanted to write something like it.
So could you give us the spark notes on the book for those that have not read it?
Sure. One night, 2 college students, a guy from Yale is waiting at the train for his girlfriend who is probably from a Seven Sisters school, maybe Wellesley, waiting for her to show up so they can spend the weekend together. He reads over this letter from her to give us an idea of what she's like. She writes the kind of letter that as an 18-year-old and 19-year-old, I wish I had gotten from someone. And they go to dinner together. And it becomes clear that this boyfriend is a fatuous so-and-so. And she's had it up to here with him, despite what her letter of affection has said. And she's in the middle of a spiritual crisis. As they unpack that, he asks her what she's been reading. She's been reading this book called The Way of the Pilgrim, which is like this Russian Orthodoxy book that has at its heart this dilemma. How do you pray without ceasing? And the pilgrim in the book discovers that the secret is to say the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. Without ceasing until it becomes part of your heartbeat. You say it like a mantra, and that's the way you pray without ceasing. She collapses at the end of the story in the restroom of the restaurant they're at, and she's saying the prayer to herself. That's the story. That's it. That's all there is. The Zooey story, Zooey is Franny's older brother, and that story takes place sort of the same weekend. Franny's at home recovering from her crisis. Zooey's an actor, and he basically gives her advice. I won't stand behind Zooey in the way that I will behind Franny, but Franny's amazing. And in the way that Franny keeps the Way of the Pilgrim library book, like there's this discussion about how long she's had it checked out from the library. I kept Franny and Zooey as my Way of the Pilgrim for 2 years after reading it for the first time.
So you obviously were inspired in terms of just the writing of it, having, wished that you had written it. Could you see yourself in one of the characters? Was there that kind of identification?
I tried to think about all of these unconscious reasons why I would have dug the book, because I can't really say what I gravitated toward, except to say this, like, Franny is the sort of person that I wanted to meet at college, that I wanted to meet in high school, who I wanted to date, somebody who's a spiritual seeker who wanted to talk about books. If you had anything worth saying, like, that's what you wanted to talk about. And Lane, her boyfriend, was every pompous so-and-so I detested. So they were not people like Lane, which frankly was a little like me, thought books were worth talking about, but did so in such a prideful way that it almost made you wish they wouldn't talk about books. And so you had two kinds of people in the world, people who wanted to talk about books and people who didn't. Well, I'm 41 years old and I'm on a podcast that's asking me to talk about a book I love. So you know which category I fall into. And then you have two kinds of people in that category about book talking. People who seek to live their life in light of what they've read, and people who just want to sound smart or critical or destructive about what they've read, why certain books they've read aren't good enough, why other books they've read are great, but only because they can tell you why they're so great. And I wanted to be someone who lived my life by the books I read. And that's what Franny was trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that, since here you find yourself being a professor, and critiquing writing and all these kinds of things, and now you think about books differently, obviously, than you did, back then. Were you concerned about becoming a section man, as they term it in the book, like only criticizing and never creating?
Oh, for sure. I think about that all the time now. I think that's the other part that resonated with me. I did it to my own 18-year-old and 19-year-old self as I reread the book and thought about all the cheap, childish reasons why I loved the book, and what a stereotype I was for being the bookish nerd who liked the book about bookish nerds. There's a whole lot of J.D. Salinger that I still dig. And I think what comes through why Franny is a redeemable character to me and why I have recommended this book to other people and still will is that the questions Franny asks are the most important questions in the world. How do I live a life devoted to God? And for someone who grew up in the church where the answers to those questions were always set in stone and never seemed like any of those questions had hidden answers, I was attracted to a world where it felt like there was still more to learn about God and how my love for him could make a difference in the world. And so that's what resonated with me about the book.
So you'd say that it did, in fact, have an influence on your faith?
And just as an example, I'm sure my parents would say, as a senior and a freshman in college, they wished it hadn't had an impression on me. And I can't say so Salinger ends up subscribing to this school of Hinduism called Vedanta. And there's certainly elements of Zen Buddhism in here. I didn't go out and get a mantra. I didn't practice meditation. But the idea that I was supposed to take bromides that I'd heard, which aren't bromides, like pray without ceasing, it may be a cliche, but man, the reason it's a cliche is because people have to repeat it because it's really, really hard to live that out. And so what I saw is somebody from a completely different context than mine, New York City, super well educated, going to a Ivy League caliber school, trying to work with that. There's a moment in the book that I know I thought about where Elaine, she describes to him, Franny describes to Elaine the way of the pilgrim. And his question is this: you actually believe that stuff or what? You actually believe that stuff or what? And I think for me, as a college student, the real question wasn't whether I actually believed. I never stopped believing. It's what my faith would look like. And so, yes, Franny believes in that stuff. She just hasn't figured out how it's going to work itself out yet. That's the part that still moves me.
This is interesting that it has this Eastern Orthodox connection. I was reading just ever so briefly about Salinger and sort of his syncretistic views on Buddhism and Eastern Orthodoxy, and there's a little bit of this mystical tone. I remember seeing a video of the monks of Mount Athos who were going around with their mantra, the Jesus prayer, and how it truly was a heartbeat for them. And I'd never had any exposure like that. I thought, this is so interesting. I guess Salinger's sort of Eastern religious beliefs come through. Did you see this as an invitation to maybe broaden the experience of Christianity through a more mystical form? Eastern Orthodoxy includes a lot more mystical experience, and it's not quite the level of mental assent that we here in the West have ascribed to our religion. Did you see that it invited you in a way to a deeper experience of Christ?
Well, a little bit of context. So on the one hand, the church I grew up in was way more into ecstatic experiences of the Spirit than mainline Protestant Christianity. Okay, so I spoke in tongues, charismatic gifts all over the place. So that devotion to experiencing God in a way that was not at all normal was normal for me. Sunday morning, Sunday night, when I grew up, Tuesday and Thursday night, twice during the week, you would have those kinds of services like 4 times a week. So when I went to more staid Protestant services as an undergraduate, Baptist services, Presbyterian services, I was like, man, this is dead in comparison, okay? But in the same way, the church I grew up in thinks it's the only way. Like, talking in tongues is not the cherry on top of the I experienced God Sunday. It is the ice cream. If you don't have it, you don't have a Sunday. So if you have simple logical syllogism, you must speak in tongues to have the Holy Spirit. I have not spoken in tongues, therefore I don't have the Holy Spirit. That would be true of most of my Protestant Christian friends in college. So for me, broadening my horizons didn't involve Eastern Orthodoxy. It meant looking at somebody who went to the Baptist church on Sunday as a fellow Christian. That's what it looked like to me to expand my perspective. By and large, the people I went to church with did not go to college. If I was going to have conversations like the one in Franny and Zooey, they were going to happen with people who are not people who went to church with me, other than my mom and dad. And I don't know if they read 10 pages of this and the language that Franny and Lane used, they would have thrown it down in disgust and asked that I burn it. So to me, the expansion was A, talking with people who weren't in the church at all. B, talking with people who were in the church that I didn't consider to really be in the church. And then C, I felt like I was already an outsider, that charismatic Christianity is as close as we were going to get to Eastern Orthodoxy. At least when I encountered Baptist Student Union friends, they had no idea what was going down in my kind of church on a Sunday. Like my dad running around the pews and whatnot. So yes, the book had an effect, but not in some sort of straight line A to B.
In your first reading, all those years ago, compared to your last reading just this last weekend, what was the shift of what you got out of the book? Obviously, it was incredibly impactful when you read it the first time. Did you see anything this last time that seemed different or addressed other issues than you saw the first time or even one of those earlier times that you read it?
Yeah, the book can't offer a real lived experience of what it's like to live in light of the enlightenment that the Jesus prayer offers. It seems to me most of Salinger's stories take place in real time over a day, an evening, a weekend. Even the Zooey section is basically like 5 hours in their house, just in a row. And you get exposition of past events that inform the present, but it's really only 5 hours. So I think I was responding to Franny as an 18-year-old. She's 18 or 19 when this story takes place, and it feels like your entire life is ahead of you. And what's most important is figuring out the moment and getting through the evening and the weekend with the significant other who you kind of don't like, who you feel like you've moved beyond. And now as a 41-year-old, I'm like, I got to get up with my kid when she's got the pukes, and I've got to be a good husband to my wife after a frustrating day at work when I don't feel like being super charitable. I just want to come home and be passive. I read 9 stories this weekend at a spring dairy show. A spring dairy show at the T. Ed Garrison Livestock Arena in Pendleton, South Carolina. If you had told 18-year-old me, hey, you're going to drive a car that parks at a livestock arena and you're going to be there for the next 3.5 hours. And guess what? Your kid who's 6 is going to be showing cattle there for the next 5 years, Lord willing. I would have said something has gone desperately wrong with me or the world or both. And that's where I was this weekend. That's not super glamorous on its face. It's certainly not living in New York City and figuring out how to incorporate the way of the pilgrim into your life when you're sitting in a fancy restaurant with your Yale boyfriend. But it's real life, and it's where I need to be connected to God. So that's the difference, I think.
Do you have a favorite paragraph or a favorite quote or a favorite passage that sums up the book that you have gone back to time and again?
One of the things that I've noticed about Salinger when you sort of bogart all of his work in a weekend like I just did, it's not that hard. There's Catcher in the Rye. There's a collection of 9 short stories called 9 Stories. There's Franny and Zooey, and then 2 novellas that are collected, Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour an Introduction. When you read them all together, you sort of get the stylistic ticks more clearly. Salinger was an amazing letter writer. I'm going through the biography right now, and Salinger was an enlisted counterintelligence corps officer in World War II. He actually landed on Utah Beach on D-Day, saw an incredible amount of carnage, PTSD out the yin yang. He was dating Eugene O'Neill's daughter when he went into the service, and apparently wrote these 10-page love letters almost every single day. And the letters were so good that Una O'Neill's girlfriend, who was dating William Saroyan at the time, would like crib little one-liners from it to put in her letters to William Saroyan. And when you go back through Salinger's work, he does so much exposition work that is plot stuff, so much characterization work, and just so much great stylistic writing through letters. Letters appear in both halves of Franny and Zooey. So I'm just going to read the letter that Franny has written Lane. And by the way, all of the stuff I'm about to read, which is super lovey-dovey, gets undercut as soon as Franny shows up and she has to see Lane's face. The mark at the top is Tuesday, I think. Dearest Lane, I have no idea if you will be able to decipher this, as the noise in the dorm is absolutely incredible tonight and I can hardly hear myself think. So if I spell anything wrong, kindly have the kindness to overlook it. Incidentally, I've taken your advice and resorted to the dictionary a lot lately, so if it cramps my style, you are to blame. Anyway, I just got your beautiful letter and I love you to pieces, distraction, etc., and can hardly wait for the weekend. It's too bad about not being able to get me in Croft House, but I don't actually care where I stay as long as it's warm and no bugs and I see you occasionally, i.e. every single minute. I've been going i.e. crazy lately. I absolutely adore your letter, especially the part about Elliot. It quotes Sappho before it's done. It has 2 postscripts. It captures someone's voice. Again, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it. I would have given a lot to have received a letter like that from somebody I cared about. That's what captured my heart.
As we kind of wrap things up, any final thoughts about the book or suggestions or recommendations for those who are listening? And just out of curiosity, have you read The Way of the Pilgrim?
I haven't read The Way of the Pilgrim, but when I was a freshman, the other fun part of going back to this book was remembering that all of this happened really before I had the internet. So I didn't go out and read a biography of J.D. Salinger. I remember this like really bad research quest I had to track down the New Yorker issue from the 60s that featured Salinger's last published piece called Hapworth 16, 1924. And discovering, once I finally got to the library section where the New Yorkers were, that someone had stolen it, I was scandalized. And I wanted and tried to obtain a copy of the Way of the Pilgrim throughout my undergraduate career, and nobody had it. Now, of course, you plug it into Google and it'll pop up in 5 seconds. So no, I was never able to get it. You know, I could be cute and say like, the practical lessons of Franny and Zooey are never trust a man from Yale who eats frog legs and wants to take you to a football game on the weekend. A Yale football game? Are you kidding me? That's a sign. And if the guy is telling you as an undergraduate, he's just written a paper on Flaubert and his professor wants to publish it and he's an undergraduate, he's so full of himself that you should slap his face and leave immediately. But in all seriousness, I would say give yourself the favor of reading a book you loved when you were young and haven't read in a long time. It's as good a side-by-side comparison as you'll get to show you who you were and who you are now. And the many ways God has been grateful to you. I'm thankful I didn't end up like Lane. I'm thankful, frankly, I didn't end up with someone like Zooey. I couldn't have handled all the drama. I didn't know what I was asking for when I wanted a letter from someone like that. And the sheer delight of being able to read someone's work again 20 years later and not cringe. And in the same way, be able to see a bunch of new stuff that I know I wouldn't have gotten when I was 18 is just one of the acts of grace God has given me. What a blessed life I have to be able to read a tattered book 25 years later and think about what it meant to me then and all the things God has done for me in the in-between times. It's what makes life worth living.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, and we so appreciate it, Dr. Sircy. And to those who have listened, we thank you, and we'll see you next time on Moments That Matter. Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.